Hello everybody, and thank you so much for joining today's session. My name is Mina Kamath and I'm hosting today's World Built Environment Forum session on climate contracting. So I'll introduce myself and our wonderful panel in just a moment, but first, I thought I'd just better explain why you've given up an hour of your no doubt very busy day to learn about legal contracts. Now, most organizations on this call will already have thought at some level about setting climate, nature, or broader sustainability goals, either at asset, portfolio, or organizational level. But we sometimes give less attention to the actual mechanics of how to go about meeting those goals. Legal contracts can help you do that. So our objective with our time that we have today is to share with you how you can do that in your organization and to learn from the experience of our panel who are already pioneering the use of climate contracts in their legal contracts. So on to the introductions then. I'll start. I'm Mina Kamath, Head of Built Environment at the Chancery Lane Project, and you'll learn a bit more about what we do a bit later on in the session. I work with organizations across the real estate and construction sectors, both public and private sector, helping them to embed climate-friendly contracting practices. I'm a real estate lawyer by background. I worked at international firms Linklaters and DLA Piper for many years, and I've always been fascinated by how the physical spaces we create shape our daily lives and the impact that this can have on the natural environment. So this job is kind of a dream gig for me. I'm super excited about the experts that we've got on our panel today. So everyone's got their cameras on, I think. Thank you so much. So joining us today, we've got Becky Annison, Diane Dixon, Veronica McGarry, and Chirag Rao. I'll let them all introduce themselves to you individually. So Becky, let's start with you.
Thank you so much. I'm Becky Annison. I'm the head of supply chains at the Chancery Lane Project. But some years ago in a former life, I spent about 12 or 13 years as an in-house solicitor for Carillion, working in their facilities management business. So while not directly related to construction, very, very close to it. I'll pass on to somebody else, Mina.
Wonderful. That's great. Thank you so much. Diane.
Hi, I'm Diane Dixon and I'm the Commercial Director of MAC Contracting. I'm also doing a PhD to study the legal and contractual risks in green building. I've got 25 years in construction as a quantity surveyor and contracts manager. So I've been working directly with amending contracts to try and make them more palatable for the supply chain. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. And Veronica.
Hi there, I'm Veronica McGarry and I am really excited to be here, so thank you in advance for having me. I am a commercial policy advisor in the Cabinet Office. I am a commercial policy specialist with over 12 years of public procurement experience. My current role is in the Cabinet Office commercial policy team, where I work on policies around, just to be clear, procurement policies around sustainability, social value and cybersecurity. I also am the author of the Cabinet Office's carbon reduction schedule contract terms. I've previously worked for the Forestry Commission and I studied marine biology and marine resource development and conservation at my time at university. So this is a topic that's very close to my heart.
Thank you, Veronica. And Chirag.
Hi, everyone. Really delighted to be here. My name is Chirag Rao. I'm a lead counsel at Field Energy, and I've been here for nearly 3 years. Field Energy, we're committed to tackling the climate crisis by owning, operating, and optimizing large-scale battery storage sites in the UK and in Europe. Prior to Field, I spent a decade in private practice as a real estate lawyer. I have been personally involved with climate clauses with TCLP over the last 5 years, and also more recently with Field. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. Really excited for the discussion. But before we get into the main discussion, I'm just going to kick off with a quick 5-6 minute overview of climate contracts, just to really set the scene about what we're going to be talking about today. And then we'll get into the discussion. Oh, and I should have said as well, for the audience, if you want to ask any questions at any point, please feel free to do so using the chat function, which you should be able to see. For me, it's on the top right of my screen, so hopefully you can all access that and send your questions. I will try and monitor them and raise them if time allows. So, climate contracting. Here's the big idea. Every decision that you make, or that your organization makes has a carbon footprint attached to it. So that's things like, which supplier are you going to choose? Are you going to have renewable energy at your office or whatever the asset is? How are you going to transport your goods, and so on? And underlying every single one of those decisions is a legal contract. Some contracts last just weeks or months, but many contracts in our built environment world last for years, 5, 10, even 15, 20 years. Now, if those contracts don't reflect the climate goals that you've set, then you're locking in the emissions associated with that decision that you've made far beyond 2030, which we're only 5 years away from, and potentially getting quite close to 2050, critical years for achieving whole world decarbonisation. So I guess the question we're really asking you is, how will you actually meet your sustainability goals? How will you comply with your climate transition plans if you're signing up to long-term agreements today that don't reflect those goals? So what we're finding at the Chancery Lane project is that businesses and public bodies across the world are really waking up to the idea of rewiring their contracts to be able to drive decarbonisation measures. Contracts aren't just documents, they're conversation starters, setting the framework for how different parties can work together to achieve the same objective. And it goes further than that too. Using contracts to enshrine your sustainability goals isn't just about compliance. It's about demonstrating real commitment to investors, regulators, and stakeholders. Contracts help you to prove not just what your goals are, but exactly how you plan to meet them. There's a couple of bullets on the next slide there, Danielle, as well. So that is where we come in. So on the next slide, this is us, the Chancery Lane project. What started as a handful of lawyers brainstorming solutions has grown into the world's largest network of legal and business professionals focused on climate contracting. We're a non-profit and we provide high quality and, most importantly, open access and entirely free model contract clauses, which are rigorously peer reviewed by some of the best and probably most expensive legal minds in the world. Our content spans multiple countries, not just the UK, and here on the screen you can see a few of the contributors from our network, really just a handful of them. So many incredible people and incredible organizations have been involved with bringing together what you can see on our website. We have not just clauses, but also guidance notes. We have a glossary of standard terms. Every clause on the website is given the name of a child who's close to one of the people who drafted the clause, or in one case, I think also the name of a rescue dog owned by someone who drafted one of our clauses. And the reason for that is really just to help contextualize and remember why it's so important to future-proof your contracts. You can use the clauses exactly as they are, or more likely, you can take them from the website and use them as inspiration, working with your lawyers to tailor them to your specific needs and projects. Okay, so getting a bit more specific just for the next minute or two, how and where do climate contracts or climate-friendly clauses actually fit in the built environment? So thinking about things on the operational level first, you can see a few of the examples on the screen there. I would love to talk about them all, but time wouldn't permit that today. So let's pick one of those. Green leases, I think a concept that most people will be familiar with. So you've got your contract between your landlord and your tenant. That contract could mandate energy efficiency measures, for example, or could require the tenant to use renewable energy or to use recycled materials in their fit out, reflecting circular economy principles. It could require data sharing, real-time metering, all sorts of things that you can do with a lease clause to make it more green. On the UK side, we work very closely with another fantastic non-profit, the Better Buildings Partnership, and we sat on their steering committee for their recently updated and relaunched Green Lease Toolkit. So although it's based on UK principles, it can be really easily adapted to other countries. And we also have a great relationship with other fantastic Green Lease organizations globally, like Green Lease Leaders in the US, for example. Turning to embodied carbon, so many places where you can have clauses to help reduce your embodied carbon, and I think we'll hear a bit more about that today from our panelists. Thinking about waste management, for example, you hear a lot of construction companies at the moment setting targets like, we aim for a reduction in waste intensity by 30, 40, 50% by whatever year, we aim to divert 95% of construction site waste away from landfill, those sorts of targets. But if you don't pull those back into the early pre-contract documents, so I'm thinking about things like your supplier selection questionnaire, due diligence questionnaires. If you're not asking potential suppliers to provide information on how they will meet this goal, then you're already on the back foot with meeting that goal. It's going to be a lot harder. And if you then choose a supplier based on what they said in answer to a question about how will you help us meet this goal, then it's not right for the building contract or the appointment or whatever the relevant contract is to be silent on that. That contract has to reflect what the supplier will do. So if they exceed or meet the requirements, how are you going to deal with that? Are they going to get an incentive payment, or is it just great, business as usual? And what happens if they don't meet the requirements that they promised at tender stage that they would get? What action might you take in that stage? So you can see how that your goal, your sustainability goal, has to be threaded through your pre-contract and contract stage in order for the goals to work. Hopefully that kind of shows that every stage of a building's life cycle is dictated by contracts. If we change those contracts, we can change the future of the built environment, clause by clause, project by project. Because sustainability isn't just about publishing glossy reports and setting impressive targets. It's about the mechanisms that make those targets real. Contracts are one of the most underused tools in your climate strategy, but they don't have to be. So I hope that provides a bit of an introduction, bit of an overview, but I think the real learnings today will come from hearing from our panelists who are actually doing this in practice and helping people to do this in practice. So with that, let's get started with our first question. So I'm going to ask this question. Oh, and if panelists could just pop your videos on if you haven't already for me, thank you very much. I'm going to ask this question round robin style, which just means I'll go around everyone individually and you'll each have a minute, maximum 2 minutes to give me your answer, please. So the question is, what are the main benefits of incorporating climate clauses into contracts? And we're going to start with Veronica, please.
Thanks, Mina. So in 2019, the UK government amended the Climate Change Act 2008 and introduced a target of at least 100% reduction in the UK territorial carbon account by 2050. So this is known as the government's net zero target. And as we recognise that environmental and greenhouse gas emissions considerations feature in the aspects of the delivery of most public contracts, we identified that there was opportunities for contracting authorities to take steps to support the net zero commitment and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions through public procurement. So in 2021, we introduced the carbon measure, which requires suppliers tendering for contracts over £5 million per year to have a carbon reduction plan in place for their whole organisation. We provide a template for the carbon reduction plans that suppliers fill out and submit as part of their selection questionnaire response. It requires organisations to commit to achieving net zero by 2050 or earlier. They have to outline their carbon emissions for Scope 1, Scope 2 and 5 of the mandatory Scope 3 categories, and then tell us about steps that they are taking to reduce their carbon footprint. And this all has to be signed off by somebody at their board or the senior leadership team. So this means that we can ensure that suppliers awarded high value contracts are helping to meet the government's commitment and share their aims. In March 2024, we took this a little bit further and we introduced a standard carbon reduction contract schedule. This is a set of standard terms and conditions that are intended to be considered alongside broader sustainability obligations and included where relevant to the subject matter and proportionate in government contracts. This allows specific emissions reductions targets to be made in contracts and monitored and managed as part of the business as usual contract management.
Brilliant. That's super interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. Chirag, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Draws quite nicely from what Veronica was saying. So from our perspective, climate risk is a business risk. And we need contracts to be able to mitigate those risks. So I think having climate clauses can really help businesses manage that potential legal and financial liabilities that are associated with climate change impact. Whether you're talking about carbon emissions, you're talking about environmental damage, and as you said, it's about future-proofing those contracts. Second is really, I think, about improving contractual clarity and performance. I think it's really important that you define specific climate-related obligations, and you have performance metrics, transparency, accountability. I'll be talking about one of the clauses that we have adopted called the Nathan Ersa clause, and how we are going about kind of using metrics to ensure compliance. And it's really about, I think, effective monitoring, allowing mechanisms that can monitor and report climate-related performance, risk management, etc. The third point, in terms of a business benefit, is really investability. Now, as we race towards 20, as we race towards net zero, also with the government's plan on CP30, a lot of investors are becoming increasingly climate conscious, and therefore, investability of projects is super important, and having these clauses really helps with that investability. And I think the fourth point is really, we're very committed to the climate crisis. I think climate line clauses helps to demonstrate a business's commitment to combating climate change, and also then it's kind of a cascading effect to help others within your supply chain do the same. So I think, to conclude, by incorporating climate clauses, obviously we can contribute to a more sustainable future, but we can reap a lot of business benefits in the form of risk mitigation, improving performance, and showing a commitment.
Great points. Thank you very much, Chirag. Becky.
Thank you. I think that I wanted to come back to this point about future-proofing, because I think it's really important. We're in a regulatory environment. Yes, there's some political upheaval going on around climate at the moment, absolutely, but we still have expected legislation coming from the EU in some shape or form, which is touching on climate. I don't think that trend is going to go away. It might slow down, but I don't think it's going to go away. So I think that anything that we can do right now to start aligning our contracts with those regulatory requirements that are coming down the line and will be coming down the line even further is going to be really good. And I think the earlier you do that, the better. I've talked many times about the point of a contract is that you lock the parties into terms. That's the golden feature of them. That's why they're so good. That's so that you can make investments in people or warehousing space, because you've got these people locked into the terms. But when you do that, you lock in the carbon. And so one of the things I always want people to think about is, if you're signing a contract of any sort of medium length or longer, sort of 4 or 5 years plus, if you haven't got anything in there about climate, you've just undercut your ability to do anything really with that contract on climate until it expires. So I think this is where the future proofing comes in, is making sure that you are not cutting off opportunities to do the things that you want to do in 4 or 5 years because of what you're signing today and tomorrow. And I think the transition plans also plays into this really nicely. There's increasing requirements for transition plans coming from a lot of different places. And again, as I'm often fond of saying, it doesn't really matter what's in your transition plan. It doesn't matter what you've put on your website in terms of your targets. If that isn't reflected in your contracts are going to win. And so again, it's this kind of idea of how are you making the whole system talk to each other so that every bit of what you're doing, but especially your contracts, is lining up to make this something that you can deliver.
Thank you, Becky. That's absolutely spot on. Diane, keen to get your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. So incorporating climate clauses is not just about compliance. It actually offers strategic benefits as well. So, especially in terms of reputation and competitive advantage. If we look at the increasing stakeholder expectations, whether from investors, regulators, or consumers, offering a contractual commitment to climate goals can really demonstrate accountability, but this can also help to build trust. Now, in terms of procurement, many clients and investors are now prioritising ESG performance in procurement and funding decisions. So companies that have strong sustainability commitments and offer climate contracting will potentially have a clear advantage when it comes to the scoring systems during the bidding processes. Also, in terms of sustainability, the regulations and standards are constantly evolving. So organisations that adopt climate contracting are, like the others have said, effectively future-proofing themselves against this continuously changing landscape. And finally, from a reputation and leadership perspective, companies that integrate climate commitments into contracts are essentially positioning themselves as sustainability leaders, potentially strengthening their brand and credibility. Now, this is particularly important as greenwashing scrutiny intensifies. So having clear enforceable clauses can actually provide tangible evidence of action in terms of greenwashing. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you all for those insights. It's a really helpful way to just frame the importance of what we're talking about. So thank you. And with that, I think we can move on to question 2. So question 2, Chirag and Veronica in particular here, because I know you have a lot of experience of using the clauses in practice. So my question is around how you got started with incorporating climate clauses effectively. I'd love to hear from both of you. Why don't we start with Chirag?
Thank you. I think what's really helped is that a number of members of the legal team were already very much involved or embedded with TCLP before we actually joined Field. So that really helped. But I think there are two pieces. One is the internal stakeholder management piece. So getting that buy-in from key internal senior stakeholders with internal comms is just so important, so that we as a business are completely aligned in terms of why we want to use climate clauses, what we want to get out of them. So a couple of examples. So TCLP case study. So we recently, the legal team worked very closely with our ESG team to assess how we have and can continue to use climate clauses within the business. And as a result, we contributed to the TCLP case study. Please do check it out. Next is a clause that we worked very closely with TCLP to produce is called Lathan Irsa clause. And I want to really talk to you about that because it's a really important clause. It's an interest ratchet mechanism for loan facility agreements that effectively lowers the cost of capital for companies that save carbon in their operations. So the ratchet clause is based on carbon avoidance. It initiates discussions on how companies like Field and our investors can effectively realize, track, measure carbon avoidance. And the existence of this clause pushes all of us to develop accurate and verifiable methods for measuring and tracking, which we talked about earlier. So the actual result of this clause is the fact that we have taken a leading role in our industry group ESN in discussions on methodologies for calculating carbon avoidance. And I think the clause itself is really known between our peers and kind of highlights the commitment to understanding this metric and helps stand out. Then is the external stakeholder piece, which is really important, can be challenging. I think from the onset, it's really important, insofar as is possible, to make climate considerations part of the commercial rationale of the contract, heads of terms, commercial discussions. And we worked, my construction colleague Jonathan has worked really, really hard and really closely with our stakeholders within our supply chain on the balance of plant and the battery storage contractors to see how we can implement climate clauses. And the clauses we've tried to implement are, or in the process of trying to do so, is Tristan's clause, which relates to procuring materials and carbon budgets, Luna's clause, which introduces net zero aligned construction modifications, Francis's clause on climate aligned construction waste, and finally the NECO climate cooler plate clause. So we're only at the very early stage of our journey on this, but we hope we can continue to incorporate more clauses. But we made a start. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Fascinating to hear. Thank you so much. Veronica.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and hopefully this will kind of echo what Chirag has just kind of spoken about. So as I outlined before, the carbon measure was already in place, and we have a monitoring process in place to record compliance, etc. And we knew that the measure was being applied well. However, the carbon reduction plan only applies at a supplier level for the whole of their UK footprint. So we didn't have anything that was contract specific. And there was a desire to go a little bit further. So we started looking at how we could create a schedule of contract terms that could be included in contracts. So the ask was to create something at contract level that could be used to ask suppliers to outline what specific decarbonisation actions they would take in the delivery of the specific contract. This could then be monitored and reported against in the course of contract management. So I've broken this down into steps. The first two kind of ran concurrently. So the first step was to identify stakeholders and start engagement. So I stood up a working group that was made up of commercial policy and subject matter experts from across central government, so that I could really use that group to inform and consult on the content of the terms. The second part was really to find out what was already in place. So I knew that some departments had their own schedules of terms that they were already using, and they were willing to share those. This allowed me to look at what common clauses were being used and any innovations that we could sort of cherry pick to use. It also allowed me to see any sector specific aspects that we needed to consider for the whole standard template. I then looked a bit wider to see what else was in use across the private sector and if there was any best practice that we could take from there, which is how I became aware of the Chancery Lane project. I used existing networks to get in touch with the Chancery Lane project, and I reached out to them and asked about their terms, how they work, and if they had any guidance or feedback on how we could implement them. I was able to explain what I was doing and outline the aims, and they were really so supportive. Throughout the drafting process, I identified that there was a gap in the terms that I'd received from other departments, and we had nothing to incentivise delivery or achievement of targets. So the Chancery Lane project pointed me towards their Jess and Rory clause around gain share, which is a mechanism that I've adapted and included in our schedule. I also included an amended version of Luna's clause as a mechanism to handle any modifications required throughout the life of the contract. I drafted the terms and the guidance to sit alongside it and cross-checked it with the working group and our legal advisors to be sure that it could work in practice. This stage was probably the most difficult and time-consuming. If you think about everything that the government procures, there's such a wide variety of goods and services, so it was really clear that one size wasn't going to fit all. And also when we looked at the maturity of departments and the supply sectors that they were working with, they were all at very different stages of maturity in terms of sustainability. So there was a lot of differing opinions over what should be included and what should not be included. So what I decided to do was that we would make a lot of the clauses optional, so that it was almost departments can almost decide whether to cut and paste and include them, just to make sure that we weren't pushing departments or supply chains too far and asking them for things that weren't feasible, but also to ensure that there was stretching targets there for any suppliers or contracting authorities that thought that they could use them. So this way there are contract specific emissions reduction clauses that can be included in most contracts. The final step was the marketing exercise, and it was getting the final terms out there and into awareness within the commercial teams across government. So speaking with individual departments and industry groups, I really was able to showcase the schedule of terms. This allowed me to dispel any myths around how and when to include it and to give advice on the considerations to take when including it in contracts. So the schedule has been out there for almost a year, and it will be included in the government standard contract templates, which are due to be published imminently.
Fantastic. So much in both of those. Thank you both. And I think the theme that came through really strongly was the way that you work with others to get this sort of thing done, and that collaboration between teams, both within and outside your organization. So fantastic to hear that. Thank you very much for sharing. So the time has gone quickly. We're somehow about halfway through our session today. So I thought it might be a good point to pause and ask the audience a quick question. So Danielle, if you're able to bring up our poll question, please. The question for you to answer is, what would you need to help you implement climate contracting at your organization? So you've heard a little bit about what it's all about, and how do you think that would go down in your organization? What would you need to help you? So give you a minute or two there whilst I check the chat for questions as well, and then we'll move on to the next question. I'm not sure if everyone can see the live results. I'm getting some live results which show the initial answers are showing training and knowledge for internal team, and training and knowledge for counterparties, for example, tenants or suppliers are an important part of this. So I'm sure that's something that we'll touch on. I think we can probably keep an eye on this. Looks like answers are leveling off. Definitely the training for internal team is coming up with more than half, about 58% at the moment. So that looks like the winners. That's really useful to know, because as I said, we try and help organizations to do this. It's really helpful for us to know that that's the sort of thing you're looking for. So probably leads us quite nicely into our next question, and I'd like to bring Diane and Becky into this one as well. So the question is, what are the challenges of incorporating climate clauses into contracts, and how can these be overcome? Diane, do you want to kick us off with this?
Yeah, so one of the main challenges that I've encountered is that climate clauses are often seen as an additional risk, particularly in the supply chain, where obligations and terms are already quite often being unfairly or unrealistically flowed down. So to try and support the supply chain, and rather than imposing rigid top-down obligations, employers and contractors should ensure that climate clauses are fair and proportionate to the supplier's role, their scope of works, but that they're also within their influence. Contracts should also be project and supplier specific, and distribute commitments realistically, to prevent this excessive risk transfer. Now, another challenge that I've come across is the lack of awareness across the industry, which touches on that poll really, and the knowledge gaps that currently exist. So many stakeholders seem to lack experience of climate clauses and not fully understand what their implications are. This can obviously create resistance, particularly where businesses don't have in-house sustainability or legal expertise. So one of the solutions of this is basically why we're here today. We're here to share knowledge and raise awareness, and to support the wider understanding of climate clauses and their role in sustainable contracting. But we could also introduce some industry-led training and guidance to further improve understanding and help build confidence across the industry in climate contracting. And finally, there's a challenge of balancing ambition with practicality. Climate clauses really need to be ambitious enough to drive real change, but they also need to be realistic and achievable. If they're too stringent, they run the risk of non-compliance. But also, if they're too vague, they're really unlikely to be effective. So the solution to this is that climate obligations should be tailored to the specific project and the industry sector to ensure practicality. Or we could introduce maybe performance-based incentives such as financial benefits or contract renewals, which could also help to drive engagement. And contracts should allow for flexibility and periodic review. This could help with to adapt to the changing regulations, and the changing standards and technology, in the industry at the moment. So to wrap this up, I've seen that climate clauses work best when they're clear, when they're fair, but also when they're commercially viable. Thank you.
Really insightful there. Thank you very much, Diane. Becky, keen to get your thoughts as well.
Yes, I was going to pick up on the last thing that Diane said about commercial viability, because I think this becomes the elephant in the room, doesn't it? You know, there's a cost of living crisis, the cost of everything is going up. How can I justify the cost of climate clauses? Because let's be honest, in many cases, going for the greener, lower carbon option, whether that's in concrete or steel or anything else, is usually more expensive. And I think that's a really hard one to get around. I'm going to do my best, but I think that we need to acknowledge that that's real, and that's a real struggle for people. I think that I would like to have that conversation broadened out, though, when we talk about costs. That's how I conceptualize it. You know, we are very, very worried about the cost of this contract going up because we ask people to cut carbon. We are not having open and frank conversations about the cost to me over the last 10 years of climate change, of how that impacted my supply chain, how that meant that I didn't get the materials when I needed them, how that meant I was late, and that meant I had liquidated damages to pay on this job. I think that one of the things that we have known now since COVID is that supply chains are quite fragile things. Global supply chains are quite fragile, and one of the ways in which they're quite fragile is climate change, whether that is flooding in the place where your warehousing is, whether that is mudslides or wildfires in the place where parts of your goods are being manufactured. And so I think that almost before I want people to start worrying about costs to do with making something more green, I would love businesses to start worrying about the costs and the risks to them of wildfires, of floods, of mega storms, and start really mapping that onto their supply chain. I have this perhaps naive idea that if businesses started calculating those costs, and calculating the increased insurance premiums that we're all paying as a result, and started then projecting that out for where we think we're going to be in 5 to 10 years with the trajectory of global warming we're on, I think that then we have a very, very different conversation about costs. And so one of the ways that I would tackle some of the other issues around this is seen as green things are seen as an additional risk, or you have people who are just unfamiliar with how all of this works, is that I think that actually across all businesses, we need to get very, very familiar with the risks of what climate change is doing. We need to get very literate in order to start protecting our businesses and the bottom line of our businesses. I do think that going green often does cost more. I think sometimes it doesn't when you have some great circular economy principles going. And that can save you money, but I think for the most part it often does add costs. But what I have noticed is that the companies who are most committed to climate change, they have accepted that a level of cost is going to be necessary. They have become familiar with that idea. They have made a strong business case, which has been signed off, as Chirag was saying earlier on, getting that senior level sign off, and they are successfully decarbonising. But there was a level, I think, of understanding that we aren't going to get out of this without spending some money, everybody, and whether that comes in the form of massively increased risk and cost, or whether that comes in the form of paying a bit more on the green premium side, I think that that is the conversation that I'd like us to be having. I think the other conversation that I would be interested in having is lawyers. I think that lawyers can be a massive blocker here, and I say that with love as a lawyer, and I remember back in the day, if I was faced with a contract clause and I didn't understand it and I did not know what it did, I was putting red pen through that thing, because you're very busy, you've got a stack of these things on your desk, a climate clause comes through, you don't really understand the precise risk that that's going to pose your business, so you're just going to strike it out. So I think that one of the things that we at the Chancery Lane Project are doing is trying to help educate lawyers better, so this is not unfamiliar, so that we lawyers don't prolong your negotiations because we don't understand what the businesses are trying to achieve. So yeah, I think that the lawyers ourselves can be a risk when it comes to climate contracting. We're trying to help fix that, and I think there's a lot of good lawyers out there trying to educate themselves as well.
That's great, Becky. Thank you. And yes, I hear you very much on the lawyer's point as well. Brilliant. Thank you. Very, very, very helpful comments from you both there. We'll move on to the next question, which is, so the question is, how are or how could outcomes around clause use be monitored, and what tools or metrics should the industry be considering when it comes to using clauses effectively? So I'm going to go to Chirag first on this one.
Thanks, Mina. Firstly, I think Diane and Becky raised some really valid points. But it's about taking that fair, commercially viable, pragmatic approach, and absolutely, as lawyers, we need to be enablers. We need to be enabling this and ensuring this happens. So I think I want to give a couple of examples. So from a field perspective, we obviously have developed this interest ratchet clause, and it's a really innovative mechanism that values avoided carbon as a result of our operation of energy storage. So by adopting that carbon ratchet, we can showcase the value of lowering carbon. So how do we monitor that? How do we what metrics are we using? So carbon avoidance is actually calculated half hourly, based upon displacement of a marginal emitter at each given time. So an average energy storage systems charge when the grid's carbon footprint is lower than when they discharge. So we basically are using data from reputable and independent sources, and the methodology basically analyzes both historical and future performance, but it's really the historical data that is relevant for the ratchet. So, I think it's about incentivization, as we've discussed earlier. It's a first of its kind. As we're aware of methodologies on carbon tracking for battery storage, and it kind of allows us to possibly renegotiate those methodologies in the future. I then want to talk about the ARTME clause, which I work with a number of other people at TCLP to develop, and that is more relevant to the built environment as opposed to renewables. And just a quick recap on what that clause does. That enables landlords and tenants to reduce unnecessary waste and the purchase of new products, and by basically prompting them to follow circular economy principles in terms of repair, in terms of alterations, and just trying to prioritize insofar as possible the use of reclaimed, reused, recycled goods. So how can we monitor a clause like that? Probably, a role of a property manager might be very, very important. I think importance of using certain tools and certifications. The Environmental Agency actually has used a number of TCLP clauses, including ARTME clause, and they require contractors to use a certain amount of material certified under the cradle-to-cradle certified certification, and that really helps delivering against wider sustainability objectives. And I was also talking, to my construction colleague about this. Looking forward, were we to introduce a carbon budget alongside a financial budget in construction contracts, maybe we would be able to accurately measure emissions and potentially look at liquidated damages. But I think all of this, yes, monitoring is important, incentivization is important, and I think the challenge will be looking at what the possible sanction is, and you don't want to be too draconian, too onerous, but you want to ensure that you're monitoring it adequately. Thank you.
Brilliant. That's very informative. Thank you very much. Veronica, also keen to get your thoughts on this one.
Thanks, Mina. So there are a couple of aspects to what we do in government around this. So the carbon reduction plan, which is part of the organisation-wide plan that you need to have, is assessed at selection criteria. So this is before we even get to looking at a supplier's bid or their tender. We'll look at the criteria to see if they meet that or not. So this is pass fail. So if the supplier doesn't have a carbon reduction plan, then they won't proceed to the next stage of the tender. So that's a really big thing that we do in government. After contract award, this then becomes part of the business as usual contract management, because suppliers are obliged to have an up-to-date carbon reduction plan for the life of that contract. Centrally, we have a process to monitor the implementation of this policy, to make sure that it's been included in tenders, and then also to follow up and see what effect this is having on the markets. So this gives us confidence that the inclusion of the measure isn't causing a barrier for entry for certain groups of businesses, for example, small businesses. On the carbon reduction contract schedule, I designed a monitoring system that allows the actual emissions reductions to be compared to the target set at contract award every year, or more frequently if that's mutually agreeable between the supplier and the contracting authority. This makes it really clear if the supplier is on track to meet the obligations that it's set. It also allows any new greenhouse gas hotspots that might be discovered during the delivery of the contract to be included, and for new decarbonisation opportunities to be outlined. So these can feed into the gain share mechanism and the modification clauses that we've included in the standard schedule. A key point about monitoring the actual emissions versus the targets is that the guidance on the schedule outlines that targets should be proposed by the supplier and then mutually agreed with the contracting authority. So suppliers can have that assurance that the target set will be achievable. And there's also an auditing clause that gives contracting authorities assurance that they can audit the supplier's results if they felt it was required. So that just gives a bit of the two-way assurance there between both parties. Thanks.
That's brilliant. Thank you. It's really great to hear how you guys are doing this kind of live and from a practical perspective. So thank you. I'm just looking at the questions in the chat. We've got some really interesting questions, probably too many to cover all of them, but I'm going to pick out one. So this question is, given that some locations are more susceptible to the risks of climate change than others, should climate clauses include constraints on the origin of supply? Which I think is a very interesting question. Who would like to take this one?
Yeah, I'm very happy to take that one. I think that came up as a result of my section anyway, so it seems only fair that I do it. This is a great question, and my answer might seem a little glib, but I will explain myself. So no, this should not be in the climate clauses. And that's for me, because when we talk about climate clauses, we are predominantly talking about clauses that are helping you decarbonise or bring in some sort of process by which your business is meeting its climate goals. However, that doesn't mean I don't think it should be in the contract necessarily. So I said it was a bit of a glib answer. You know, most contracts and most large businesses should already have processes in place for assessing whether a contracting party is in a jurisdiction which is a high risk jurisdiction politically, economically already. That, you know, that's already part of your risk review for large businesses, is saying, should we be going out and building an airport in this country? Are they likely to pay us? Is there civil unrest that's going to put our engineers at risk? You know, so for me, this really should be folded into the ordinary business of risk assessing large contracts. And the reason I'm really keen for that to be the case is that when it comes to this sort of climate risk, it's just another risk. And by kind of hiving it off and putting it in a special bucket and saying, oh, well, we need experts and we need sustainability and nobody understands how it works, it's like, well, that doesn't take the risk away. That's just a bit like burying your head in the sand. So I would like to see the climate risks that we are undergoing as a global business economy, the wildfires, the frequency of them, I'd like to see them folded into business as usual risk, because that's what they are. So would I put them in climate clauses? No, because they shouldn't be treated differently to any other risk on the origin of supply that you already have. And one of the ways I often conceptualize this when I talk to lawyers, so if this gets a bit lawyerly, I'm really sorry, and you can all tell me off later. But we have something called a force majeure clause, which says that you don't have to deliver your part of the contract if an act of God or a list of other things in the contract intervenes. And when I was learning law, it was traditionally if a terrorist blows up the building, you no longer have to deliver the cleaning contract. And if you don't deliver the cleaning contract for the building that no longer exists, you can't be sued for breach of contract. So it's a pretty simple, straightforward, practical situation. And one of the things that I now talk to about people about the force majeure clause is I sort of say to people, well, if we know because of climate change that mega storms are not a once in a generation event, but they're happening twice a year, well, that's not really a random act of God anymore. That's something which is starting to become foreseeable. It's starting to become predictable, and it's starting to be something that we should be putting in our risk assessments. We are putting it in our risk assessments, right? So that I would like this conversation to be bringing climate into our conversations about risk assessments instead of putting it in a separate bucket and pretending it's something special, which is different from clauses which help you decarbonise.
I love that answer. Thank you, Becky. That's, yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I think we've got time to ask our panel one more question. So I'm going to ask Diane a question. And this is my question. How does climate contracting work in tandem with the various industry frameworks and standards that we have in the built environment? So, for example, the RICS whole life carbon assessment.
So there's numerous frameworks and standards for assessing and managing carbon across the built environment, from PAS 2080 and the RICS whole life carbon assessment standard to various other industry specific frameworks like ISO, British standards, European standards. But climate contracting moves these standards beyond voluntary guidance, turning them into legally enforceable commitments. If we take the supply chain engagement, for instance, the RICS whole life carbon assessment standard helps track emissions across the supply chain, from raw materials to construction phases, ensuring each stakeholder's carbon impact is monitored against the carbon reduction targets. Climate clauses make this a contractual obligation. So if we look at the Chancery Lane project's Sophia's clause, for example, this clause aligns project sustainability targets with supply chain engagement, while Jessica's clause introduces financial incentives or penalties based on meeting or exceeding carbon targets. If you're working on the NEC suite of contracts, there's also the X29 climate change clause, which also provides a built-in mechanism for delivering the agreed climate change objectives. Also, climate contracting supports the circular economy. The whole life carbon assessment standards, life cycle stages C1 to C4, assesses the carbon impact of materials at the end of life, which promotes recyclability. TCLP's Alex's clause actually reinforces this by encouraging the use of materials that can either be reused or recycled. So if we use an example, if we've got a modular unit that includes some materials that could be repurposed in future projects, Alex's clause ensures this is prioritised. So the whole life carbon assessment standard would actually track and report the carbon savings from those materials. Now, this can be taken further. Those savings could also count towards carbon targets that were set under Jessica's clause, for instance, or the NEC X29 clause, depending on contract drafting. So, in summary, integrating climate clauses with a solid carbon management framework creates a robust system for reducing emissions. So standards like PAS 2080 or the RICS whole life carbon assessment standard provide the data and metrics for tracking carbon across a project's life cycle, But climate clauses offer the contractual tools to monitor, incentivise and enforce sustainability goals. Thank you.
Really, really helpful to get a sense of how those clauses work together and in tandem with those frameworks as well. Thank you very much, Diane. We're drawing to a close, so I think we did have one more question for the panelists, but I think instead what I would like to ask you, and apologies, the slides have paused, I think, there, but what I would like to ask you is, for each of you, just to give our audience perhaps one final closing thought on what we've talked about today and the information that you've kindly shared. So maybe a practical tip or a key takeaway or the one thing that you'd like them to remember. So why don't we start with Becky?
Oh, there's been so many good things. But I think that the most practical thing that I would like people to take away is that you can't just take a climate clause, put it in a contract and hope it's going to work, in the same way that you wouldn't do that for any other sort of clause or any other sort of requirement. You need to engage your suppliers. You need your procurement teams to really understand what it is they're asking. So there's lots of preparatory, process-driven work that goes on around it to make the clauses work. But that stuff you will have been doing already in other areas for decades. It's just slightly repurposing it for climate. That's it.
Wonderful, thank you. Diane?
So because I work in the supply chain in the construction industry, a key takeaway for me would be that stakeholders ensure that any clauses are integrated or flowed down to the supply chain are flowed down fairly and proportionately to each supplier. Thank you.
Thank you. Chirag?
So I think 2 points. One, being able to take that pragmatic, balanced, commercially viable approach is super important. And the next is, my vision is, I would like climate clauses really to be embedded in a lot of contracts, and us not having to distinguish them as climate clauses. They just become an integral part of contracts. But drawing upon all the points that Becky and Diane have raised already, that they need to be well thought. Can they be monitored? Are they implementable? Just like you do with a lot of other clauses. Thank you.
Yeah, it's such a good point. Thank you. And Veronica?
Thank you. So I guess my final thought really echoes something that all the other panelists have said throughout this session today. It's around commercial viability. Contracting authorities and suppliers need to talk to each other and be honest about what you can and you can't do. The carbon reduction schedule is available on gov.uk. So if you're thinking about bidding for a government contract, have a look at that ahead of any market engagement events and have a think about what you're already doing in this space and what you could look to do in the future. If you can do more, then please tell the contracting authority that. But equally, if there's a proposed clause that won't work, for example, the supply chain cascade, then that needs to be raised as well. Contracting authorities don't want to have a failed procurement, but also, suppliers really need to challenge themselves on what they can do as well. So I guess that would be my final thought. Thank you.
Thank you. And some common themes coming out of all of that, I think, is that communication, that collaboration as well. So thank you so much to our fantastic panelists for sharing your wealth of knowledge and expertise on this topic. I really appreciate you doing this and sharing that with our audience. So thank you. To the audience, thank you for hanging on till the end. It's been a long session, but thank you very much. We've had some super interesting questions come through on AI, on blockchain, on behavior change for lawyers, net zero carbon buildings, all sorts. And I would love to have time to address them. So I hope that we have that we're able to do so. We'll find a way to get back to people who've asked questions, I hope. Thank you everyone for joining.